Elidor by Garner, 12th, The Letterbox. Electricians checked the house and went away again. Mr. Watson made a flower bed on the heap of soil where the treasures were buried. A year passed. And all this time, Roland avoided using the front door. He felt that he could never trust the door to be the way out of and into the cottage. It became a compulsion, like walking on curbstones. Helen mended the jug she had found in the hole. It was a large pitcher, and it had broken into 5 pieces. She spent hours gluing them together, almost in tears when she thought of what she had done. The pitcher had lain in the ground such a long time, and such a little care would have saved it. Now she was too late, and nothing could make it whole again. The unicorn reared below the lip, poised at the height and stillness of movement. An instant later, Helen thought, and it would have been gone. There was no other decoration except 2 lines of thick black lettering under the unicorn. Save maid that makels. No man with me mell. What does it mean, Dad? Said Nicholas. I'm not sure, said Mr. Watson. It's some sort of verse. Perhaps it's a family motto, something like, you know, the Scottish one. He gets hurt who meddles with me. What's a makeless maid? Said Roland. Well, it's hard to say exactly. I suppose you could find it in the dictionary. You've made a very good job of mending that, Helen, said Mrs. Watson. You can't really see the cracks. But I know they're there, said Helen. The year passed. It was a dark Sunday afternoon. Helen and Nicholas had gone for a ride on their bicycles. David and Roland were sitting at the table in the middle room, revising the work they had done at school that term. Through the window they could see their mother and father in the garden. Mr. Watson was planting some rose bushes. Roland tried to concentrate on his history book. He had to read 20 pages, and he found that he was more aware of the number of a page than of what was printed on it. Eventually, the words became a procession, and his mind drifted from them, first to the tablecloth and then to the window. He saw that David was drawing patterns in the margin of his notebook. Revision's the worst part of term, isn't it? Said Roland. You think you know the stuff, but you don't. And you can't take it in because you've heard it all before and it's gone stale. I can't get used to not having a front garden, said David. Every time someone goes past the house, I think they're coming here, and that front door's driving me round the bend. Oh, said Roland. Why? It keeps buzzing, said David. Haven't you noticed? It must be traffic that makes it vibrate. Anyway, what with that and the footpath right next to the house, you can't think straight even in here. I've never liked the porch, said Roland. I used it to open the mound, and ever since it's felt wrong. What? Said David. Open what? The mound, said Roland. In Elidor. Oh, that, said David. What do you mean, oh, that, said Roland. Elidor, have you forgotten? Okay, said David. We don't want the whole road to hear. Elidor, said Roland. So why can't you talk about it? You and Nick always change the subject. I think you ought to cool down a bit on this Elidor business, said David. You're mad, said Roland. All right, said David. We have been talking about it. I don't remember, said Roland. Nick said you'd only start getting worked up and we'd have a row, so we didn't tell you. Good old Nick, said Roland. He would. Thanks very much. You see, said David, you're shouting already. But you're pretending it doesn't matter, said Roland. Didn't it mean anything to you? Maelbron and the treasures and that golden castle and everything. Listen, said David. Nick's not all that dim, although you think he is. A lot of what he says makes sense, even if I don't agree with everything myself. What does he say, then, that there's no such place as Elidor and we dreamed it? In a way, said David. He's off his head. No, he's gone into more of it than any of us, said David. And he's been reading books. He says it could all have been what he calls mass hallucination, perhaps something to do with shock after the church nearly fell on us. He says it does happen. And I suppose the mud we scraped off was a mass hallucination, said Roland. Yes, I know, said David, but I think he may be right about the treasures. Try and remember, when the church was shaking all round us, we couldn't see what we were doing. And we were falling all over the place, and everything jarred so much. We didn't know where we were. That's true, isn't it? I suppose so. Well, said David, Even if we were holding the real treasures, they could have been knocked out of our hands, and we could have grabbed hold of other things without noticing. I didn't, said Roland. But it is possible, said David. If you can believe that, you can believe in treasures, said Roland. And what about the things that happened next? The television and Dad's razor and your theory about generators? Yes, it was a bit rum, said David, but it could have been a coincidence. And anyway, it was a long time ago and nothing's happened since. That's the whole point, said Roland. That's why we buried them. If we dug them up, it'd start all over again. There's not much chance of that, said David. Now that Dad's made his prize flower bed there, it'd be more than anyone's life's worth to touch it. David and Roland looked out of the window into the garden. Roland was about to go on with the argument, but what he saw stopped him. Mr. Watson was crouching just a few feet away from a rose bush that he had just planted. Others lay nearby, their roots in bags. Very gingerly, rather like a boxer, Mr. Watson sidled toward the flower bed. He stretched out his hand, flinching, nearer and nearer. Then he jumped back, as if the bush had bitten him. The children watched him do this twice before they left their work and ran into the garden. "What's up, Dad?" said David. By this time, Mrs. Watson had joined her husband and was peering at the bush. It's this Mrs. A.R. Barraclough," said Mr. Watson. "I keep getting a shock from it." "A shock? No, not quite. There's a distinct sound when I try to touch it, and I can feel a tingling in my hand." "Your hair's all frizzy too, Frank," said Mrs. Watson. How very interesting. Look, David and Roland, there must be thunder about somewhere." She put her hand near the bush, and they all heard a sharp crack. "Be careful, dear," said Mr. Watson. "It's all right, Dad," said David. "That's static electricity." Roland hurried to different parts of the garden, touching shrubs, trees, walls, fences. "There's nothing here," he called. He came back to the flower bed and put out his hand. Crack! "It's only this place." He looked hard at David. "Run and see if the glass is dropping, Roland," said Mrs. Watson. "I do hope Helen and Nick aren't going to be caught in a storm." Roland went into the house. His face was flushed and he was breathing quickly. The barometer hung on the sitting-room wall. The needle was slightly higher than it had been the previous day. "Coincidence," said Roland. "Ha!" While he was reading the barometer, the front door vibrated, a short, resonant buzz. Not very loud, but noticeable. He had heard it before on several occasions, but it was only now, since David had complained about it, that the sound grated on him. The door buzzed again, a longer note. Roland turned from the barometer, and as he passed the door, he heard someone step onto the porch. There was no mistaking this. The footpath had its own sound, and so had the porch. The flagstone gave a hard echo between the brick walls. Someone had stepped onto the porch. Without waiting for the knock, Roland drew back the curtain. The upright letterbox in the top of the door was open, and pressed close against it, Roland saw an eye. He snatched the curtain across and held it tightly in place. He heard a slight movement, and the doorknob was turned both ways, and the door shifted against the Yale lock. He could hear breathing, too. "Who is it?" said Roland. No one answered. The door still buzzed. Roland dashed out into the garden. "There's someone trying to get in through the front door," he shouted. It was so obvious that Roland was frightened that Mr. Watson dropped his spade and hurried round the side of the house to the footpath. Helen and Nicholas were wheeling their bicycles onto the curb. "Who's in the porch?" said Mr. Watson. "I didn't notice anybody," said Nicholas. The porch was empty, and so was the road. "Why, what's the matter?" "Someone looked through the letterbox and tried to open the door," said Roland. "Now, about half a minute ago." "But they couldn't have," said Helen. "We were freewheeling to see who could get nearest to home without touching the pedals. We were ages coming down the road." "Nobody went anywhere near the house," said Nicholas. "Yes, they did," cried Roland. "I heard them, and when I pulled the curtain, there was this eye staring." "Who'd want to do that?" said Nicholas. "There'd be nothing to see but the curtain." Was it you frightening Roland, Nick?" said Mr. Watson. "Me? No. Because if it was, I told you before, I won't stand for it. You're old enough to know better than to play stupid tricks like that." "But it wasn't me, Dad." "Very well," said Mr. Watson. "But I don't want it to happen again, that's all." "I didn't see anybody," I did see somebody," said Roland. "I did." "Now come along inside, Roland," said Mrs. Watson. "You know you're your own worst enemy." "But, Mum, I did see somebody." I don't doubt it, said Mrs. Watson, but you mustn't let your imagination run away with you. You're too highly strung. That's your trouble. You'll make yourself ill if you're not careful. Roland was found to have a temperature of 101. Mrs. Watson gave him aspirin and sent him to bed, cooked him a light tea, and sat with him until he appeared to be calmer. When the other children went to bed, they were told to go quietly so as not to wake Roland. They tiptoed upstairs without switching the light on. "Come in here, you lot," said Roland, and that is the end of chapter 12.